Hi everyone, welcome. What you see here is a bin of worms. The worms in this bin are responsible for helping me break down my kitchen scraps and household waste. I could bring in leaves from outside, I could give them paper, I could give them all kinds of stuff. Pretty much anything that'll break down over time is fair game as far as the worms are concerned. So it's an activity called vermicomposting or worm composting. And what you're left with at the end is this material, basically worm manure, if you want to think about it that way, which is very, very good for the plants out in your garden, or even if you just want to throw it at the base of a shrub or a tree or whatever the case may be. At the end, you've got stuff that can definitely be used outside to feed plants. So here, in this particular system, we've got some worms that, well, I've got some information about them right here I thought I'd share with you before I slip on a glove and get to work here. It's a bin of worms that were last fed 14 days ago, and this system's actually been in service now for 39 weeks. That's 273 days. And over the course of that time, the system has received 21 feedings. The feeding that I was going to give them today, their 22nd feeding, is cantaloupe, as well as a couple days worth of coffee. And I guess the nice thing is that one of those materials that they can break down is paper products, so the filters that come with the coffee go with it too, as do these couple of soiled paper towels and napkins. So let's get suited up here to get to work on this. The coverings that I've got on here have different purposes and functions. So the paper on top, I guess, is really just meant to provide them with some shade, since worms have this natural response to light, which is to flee from it. I think it's got partially to do with the fact that light is generally the sun, and if a worm dries out because if it's been exposed to the sun too long, that can usually mean its demise. The other dangerous thing about being out in the sun from a worm's perspective is that you're also visible to predators like birds and other creatures that might want to come along and make a meal out of you. Not all worms respond that way to light, but a lot of them do. And we worm farmers actually take advantage of that behavior sometimes when we want to harvest their castings, as we call their manure. Kind of a nicer name for their poop. The worm castings, when you want to harvest them, can sometimes be isolated from the worms by providing them with some bright light overhead, forcing them down into the material, and as they do that, you simply skim off the material from the top. So now I'm going to be giving them this food right down the middle, which is where I usually feed, and then I like to sometimes place some sort of a marker indicator to show where the last feeding was. In this case, it was a coffee filter, which is my traditional coffee, my traditional feeding zone indicator. And this coffee filter 2 weeks ago was placed in here brand new, so none of this wear around the edges or down the middle was here 2 weeks ago. That's the worms chewing away on the paper gradually. So now the feeding they got last time consisted of some veggies and fruits, and I think the star of the show, should it still be in here by any chance, is a pear that had been frozen. It was cut in half before it got frozen. So I'll be curious to see how they did with that over the past 14 days. I'm just kind of slowly excavating the feeding area, just so I could see how things are progressing. I think these are the leftovers of some banana stems. Here's another one that's actually holding up a little bit better. This one looks like it's almost gone. It's interesting how the worms sort of whittle their way down into the material to get at it. And now I think we're actually bumping into the two halves of the pear. I think from what I remember, I looked at the video that I prepared of that last check-in briefly to see how things looked in here. Oh my goodness. Well, if there's any doubt if worms like pear, those doubts should be dispelled just by this pile of worms as evidence. Look at all those worms coming together to nibble on this half of a pear. My goodness. That is a lot of worms coming together to eat on that half a pear. get them out of our way here. That's pretty amazing. And guess what? We've still got another half of a pair to scout out and hunt down. But since we left ourselves a feeding zone indicator, it shouldn't be too difficult to track it down. I think it would have been somewhere over here. And I have no reason to think that we're going to find anything different over there. I got a feeling we're going to find ourselves a massive pile of worms hanging out beneath this one too. I guess it was fortunate for us to have placed these downwards like this, so all the juices can simply spew out of the fruit and make it really easy for the worms to come over. This is not as impressive as this pile over here. But boy, oh boy, was that something else. And I could really feel the weight of those worms when I picked them up. I guess what I'm noticing with this other one, though, is just the size of some of these worms. A lot of them are really, really tiny worms. Just a whole pile of itsy bitsy baby worms. I'm starting to smell the pear, the scent of the pear. Interesting. It almost makes me wonder if the amount of food that I bought down for them is possibly a bit much. Because there's a good bit of pear remaining here for them. I'm curious how all the other scraps of food that they got last time is holding up. There was some other stuff placed in here like veggies, and I think you might have noticed one of these earlier is a grape. So there's a variety of different leftovers remaining in here. I have no objection to giving them some food today, even though they don't seem to need it because there's leftovers. But maybe not the entire quantity of cantaloupe that I bought down, perhaps half of it. But I would like to give them the coffee that I bought down. I've got a little collection of coffee up in the kitchen starting to pile up already anyway, as well as this morning's portion, which will be added to that little collection that I've got. So I think as far as coffee goes, I don't want to get into too much of a surplus mode. I'd rather do away with this stuff almost in real time if possible, although sometimes it does accumulate over the course of a few days. So now, these are also coffee filters and maybe other types of paper that I'd thrown into the feeding area last time we were in here to serve as additional supplementary bedding. And you know, since what they're getting today includes a couple new coffee filters, my idea here was to maybe just bring back this coffee filter that had been our feeding zone indicator previously and use that as supplementary bedding too. And then we'll just hang on to one of the coffee filters that I bought down today to serve as the replacement feeding zone indicator. This is a pretty fun bin. You might have noticed the label on the little board that I showed earlier, how these worms were recruited from the compost barrel that I have outside. So the compost barrel doesn't get harvested very frequently. It just needed some repairs because it was sort of splitting open. I wanted to empty it before I repaired it. I don't even know if I could have repaired it otherwise. And what I did was I took the contents of that compost barrel and I emptied it into a few grow bags. 3 grow bags were filled with the stuff that came out of that thing. And over time I had to let the stuff dry. It was a bit damp and unwieldy. So it's usually a lot easier to handle the castings after they've had a chance to dry a little bit and become a lot more crumbly. Kind of like the consistency of the material that you see in here. I like the material to be a little bit more crumbly so that it flows and it doesn't clump up. It just feels like the material is such that way that the worms can really come and go through all of it rather than certain portions of it being sort of inaccessible to the worms because it's all just a big clump of mud basically. So I really like the consistency of this stuff. It wasn't too long ago that I felt like the material in the system may have been going a little bit too dry, which means it was very crumbly. However, in my mind it seemed a little bit too crumbly. So I went ahead and I adopted the use of plastic covering. for a while. I don't think it had plastic coverings, making the system seem a little bit too dry. So last time the system got a few squirts of moisture, I took my water bottle that's got the Mosquito Dunks BTI solution in it, and some seeds. Those are going to grow. So I squirted some moisture into here last time, and then I figured that the pair that they were receiving would introduce some moisture into the system, and then the coverings, the plastic coverings, would prevent that moisture from being lost to evaporation. It seems like the material in here has maintained its moisture quite nicely, but it was out on the outer edges where it seemed like things were a little bit drier than I like. So I think before we cover up here, I'll probably want to check on how the dryness out there is doing. It might not be necessary to compensate too much. There's a few pieces of cantaloupe left over in the bag, but I'm not gonna give them all of it, because there's still the matter of giving them this coffee here. And you know what? Let me also sprinkle in a little bit of this pulverized eggshell, which is the type of grit that I typically administer to my worm bins, because the grit really helps the worms break down their foods and their gizzards. It's more of a mechanical type of a digestion process versus more of a chemical type process that you and I have in our stomachs with the acids. Since they don't have acids, those gritty, tough materials in their gizzards help them break stuff down kind of more mechanically, just by being ground down through the force of those rough materials being pressed up against the foods that they've consumed. So yeah, I think we've given them a fairly generous feeding. Between a couple days worth of coffee piled in with some nice yummy cantaloupe, I think they're going to be pretty happy with what they've been given here. So at the end, once we cover up, I'll bring this coffee filter back to be our feeding zone indicator, but I think it's time to start covering up. Let's just put these leftovers back in. Leftover banana stem. Here's some leftover bedding material, I guess. It's not all that important, but I like to, know where I put the last feeding, and it's usually easy enough to figure that out even without a feeding zone indicator in my systems, because it's usually down the middle, but not always. So as we cover up the feeding area, it gives us an opportunity to scope out the edges of the bin. So last time too, I sort of judged the system to be perhaps a little bit dry because of the lack of worms hanging out in the outer edges. I think this time I'm seeing possibly a little bit more worm activity out here, which is a good sign. I wanted to allow the foods that I apply to the system to be the source of hydration versus just coming in here with some water. If it was really a dire situation, the water would certainly address the matter 1, 2, 3. But I kind of prefer the moisture in the system to make its way in sort of gradually through the foods that I give them if possible. So let's just see how things on this edge are. Definitely not so many worms, but then again, if there was some juicy pear laying around, I wouldn't be too surprised if the worms ended up over there to go feast on it rather than being somewhere else in the bin. So sometimes it's kind of hard to know exactly what's causing the worm activity, whether it's related to the foods that they've been getting or possibly them sensing a little bit of dryness causing them to not want to be in certain places within the system. I'm not going to react. I'm not going to worry about the apparent, possibly excessive dryness in here. I don't even want to call it excessive dryness. It just seems apparent that way. It's like apparent dryness because of the flakiness of the material. I think we're gradually seeing the material in here get a little bit more moist and damp over time, which is really what I was after by first placing the plastic coverings on here. Oops, let's not forget to mark where we last fed. Otherwise, we won't be able to find our way back. No, it's more tradition, I think, just to want to do that. And Yeah, I just like doing it that way for some reason. Because, yeah, I could certainly come in here with a whole bunch of moisture, just spraying water. But I don't even know if it's necessary. There were worms in the outer edges, perhaps not that many. And maybe we could just write that off as because of the yummy foods that they were enjoying down the feeding zone. The way they were enjoying that first piece of pear was certainly, I think, a telling sign as to why the worms were hanging out there. They sure seem to like pear. All right, everyone. Well, that was a nice, quick little check-in with our red wigglers. I believe these are. That's how I consider these worms that come out of my compost barrel outside. I assume that they're red wigglers, but they could be anything. Who knows? And now they've just received their 22nd feeding. So I'm going to take care of getting stuff cleaned up and put away here, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. That's boring. Before I go there really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.